Okay, today we're going to be learning Rosh Hashanah Daf Tevav. Today's daf is sponsored by Beth Kislev on the 18th of Cheshvan in memory of the 11 Jews killed at Dor Chadash, New Light, and Tree of Life synagogues in Pittsburgh in 2018. They were all people who came to shul earlier, were concerned about creating community in their individual ways and within their own limits and abilities. Hashem Yikom Damam. Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, and Irvin Young. And this week's learning is dedicated by Marvin Gaynor in memory of Jerry Rabinowitz, one of those, Yehuda ben Yechezkel V'Selma Zichrono Livracha, a kind and caring and giving individual who loved Yiddishkeit and loved learning. So we will learn in their memories. We're going to start from the bottom of Yudalet Amud Bet. We had this statement, okay, just to review, we had a machloka, and it's going to get a little bit more complicated today. We're going to see there's 4 Tanaitic opinions. Yesterday, we saw only 2. We saw between Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer how we deal with an etrog tree. Is an etrog tree treated the same as a regular tree, according to Rabbi Eliezer, which means that the date we're going to go by is the date that the tree budded, both when determining what's the year of Maaser and when determining whether it's a Shemitah produce or not. So we're going to go by the year it budded. That's the way we treat trees in general. Rabban Gamliel said, that's Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Rabban Gamliel said, no, we're going to split between Maaser and Shvi'it. When it comes to Maaser, we're going to go by Lakita, by when it's gathered, when we pick it. And when it comes to Shemitah, we're going to go by when it budded. To which Rabbi Bar Rav Huna had said at the end of yesterday's daf, well, since he says that by etrog, atar lekita isuro kiyerek, we're going to treat when it comes to gathering it like a vegetable. And we said yesterday that one of the reasons people give is because it doesn't function like regular trees, that it only goes with rainwater, but it also needs to be irrigated. And therefore we treat it like vegetables, right? That had to do with all about what it's actually growing from. So as relates, now why it makes difference, Maaser and Shvi'it is another question, not so clear. But once he says that we're going to go, Atar L'Kitat Yisuro Kiyerek, so we said Rosh Hashanah Shelo Tishrei, then we're going to assume that the Rosh Hashanah for Masrot matches the Rosh Hashanah for Yerakot, like we saw in the Mishnah, which was a Chab Tishrei, and not Tu B'Shvat, like we saw by other trees. Makes a lot of sense. However, the Gemara raised a question on that from a Braita. It says, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Liket etrog, I'm back in Yudalet Amud Bet just to review because we're kind of in the middle of a question. It's hard to start without reviewing it. He says, Liket etrog erev Tu B'Shvat, ad shelo tavo hashemesh, right? You gather the etrog on the night of Tu B'Shvat before the sun sets. V'chazar v'liket mishet tavo hashemesh, and then you gather more, right? You cut some more the next morning, or that night once it's already considered the next day. You can't take masra one on the other because they're from different years. Now, what do you notice? The year is Tu B'Shvat, not a Chab Tishrei. Now, how do you know this is Rabban Gamliel? We'll see in 1 minute. So, right, because we have to establish, you could just say maybe this whole Mishnah, Braita is Rabbi Eliezer, who says it goes by, or actually it wouldn't be able to be Rabbi Eliezer, but let's say you said it's Rabbi, that's the whole point. This can't be Rabbi Eliezer, but let's say you'd say it's Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is the one who has Tu B'Shvat because he thinks we treat it like all other trees. But it's obvious it's not Rabbi Eliezer. Why? Because what did it say? If you gathered it before or you gathered it after, it's the gathering that's important and not the chanata. According to Rabbi Eliezer, it would have said, if it budded, these budded before and those budded after, then you can't combine them. Right? But that's not what it says. So anyway, we'll continue in the Braita. If it was the 3rd year going into the 4th, then, right, where it doesn't have to do with Shemitah at all, but it has to do with Maaser, then Shlishit Maaser Rishon Maaser Ani, whatever was picked in the 3rd year will be the Maaser Ani year, the poor man's time, and Revi'it Maaser Rishon Maaser Sheni. The Revi'it, the 4th year one, would be for the Maaser Sheni. It would be the 2nd time that you bring to Jerusalem yourself and eat there. So now they say what I said before, which is obvious, which is man shamat le'daza batar lekita. The verb here is he picked and brought it, right, gathered it, which is the critical moment according to Rabban Gamliel, who said that it's lekita, right? This is an etrog tree, and yet we're determining based on when it's gathered. And yet, what's the Rosh Hashanah here? What's the cutoff date? Katane Shvat. So it's obvious that we don't connect those two things as Rabbi Bar Rav Huna said. So how could you possibly say that? Really, he couldn't have said that because it makes no sense in light of this bright. So therefore, they say it's a mistake, and that's not really what he said. And they go and they reread what Rabbi Bar Rav Huna said. And they say, if he really said something like this, it must be that this is what he said. And right, this is when something just can't possibly seem right. It must be it's a mistake, and let's fix it. And this is what he said. Even though he said that the determining action, right, what happens to the tree determines, right, whether it's Shemitah or Maser, is the gathering and not the budding, but still Rosh Hashanah Shalosh Shvat. But we're not going to treat it any differently as all other trees in terms of the date that becomes the beginning of the year. So the beginning of the year is determined by Rosh Hashanah, but the action that the beginning of the year is Rosh Hashanah Leila. No, it's Tu B'Shvat. But the action that determines it is different from all other trees. So it's similar. It has the same date, according to Rabban Gamliel, but the action that determines which year it belongs to is not like all other trees. It doesn't go by budding. It goes by when you picked it. Now they have a very small aside question. In the Braita that we just quoted about Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, it said if it was in the third year going into the fourth year. But in an earlier Braita, when we talked about this distinction between years, and you have Yashan and Chadash, you can't take from the new and the old, and then it gave an example again of if it's not just that you can't combine these, but it's the issue also, how do we know which year of the Maser cycle it is? It said second going into third year. So they want to know, why did this Braita say second going into third, and this one said third going into fourth? Now, the easy answer could just be, someone said that Braita, they gave a, right, when if two teachers are teaching the same material in different classes, the example each one brings is very likely going to be different. But they assume here there should be some consistency within Braita, and maybe there's something more significant going on here. So Ma'ishna Hatam, why there in the early in this Braita that we in the earlier Braita that we saw, not today? Ma'ishna Hatam dekatane, that it said, if it was the second year going into the third year, why is that different from here? And here it said third going into fourth. So they say, something which you could check out and find out if it's true. Milta agav orche kamash. Wanted to teach you something, an aside, which is what? Etrog kashile yada. An etrog tree doesn't do well when everybody's touching it. It's a very sensitive tree. Therefore, what's the problem? On the Shemitah year, what happens? Everything becomes hefker. Hefker means that you take all your fruit trees and you say, oh, anyone can come and take. That means people can walk into your backyard or your field and just take whatever they want. That means that your etrog tree is going to be touched by a lot of people. And when that happens, the tree reacts, doesn't do very well. And as a result, what happens? Lo time pere ad tlachni. Okay? So I skipped a line. Because everybody touches it all throughout the Shemitah year, lo time pere ad tlachnim. It takes it 3 years to recuperate. So there wouldn't really be an example of it grows in the second year going in, right? It budded in the second year going into the third, because after the Shemitah year, it kind of goes into a state of shock, right? They talk about trees going into a state of shock. And because of that, it won't grow for another 3 years. So they couldn't depict an example of 2 going into 3 because they don't grow yet until the third year going into the fourth year. It takes it a few years to react to the to the trauma. Now it happens that I know trees do go into trauma and don't bring up fruits. I have fruit trees. My avocado tree hasn't grown. Now finally I have avocados, but for years after we cut it one year, it kind of just went into shock and wouldn't grow fruits. So it definitely happens. Whether it happens from people touching it in the Shemitah year, I don't know. And then all of us, you obviously have to then ask the question, if we do that with all our etrog trees, how do they end up with etrogim for the next number of years? Then we're going to have a shortage of etrogim. So I don't know. But anyway, they say that's the reason why they brought that example. Now we're going to have the same question that we just dealt with, the Rabbi Bar Rav Huna. We have the same question that Rabbi Yochanan asked Rabbi Yanai. Etrog Rosh Hashanah shaloi matai. When is the Rosh Hashanah for etrogim? Because again, understanding that it might be somewhat different. So, in terms of the date, the action, the likita versus chanata of other trees. So is its Rosh Hashanah any different? Amarle, Shvat. He said, it's Rosh Hashanah Shvat. So now he asks him an interesting question, which it's interesting because we think of Shvat as one of the months of the lunar calendar. But now he asks the following question. Shvat de Chodashim or Shvat de Tkufa? What is Shvat of the Tkufa? The Tkufa we talked about is the solar cycle. Is it the Shvat of the solar cycle? All of a sudden it sounds like there's two Shvats. There's a Shvat that's our lunar calendar, and there's a Shvat of the solar cycle. So what does that mean? Rashi explains there's what's called Tkufa Tevet. Tkufa Tevet is the winter solstice, right, which is on December 21st, shortest day of the year. That's what's called Tkufa Tevet. Shvat of the Tkufa is 30 days after Tkufa Tevet, just like in the lunar months. Shvat comes after Tevet, right? It's the next month. So the Shvat of the Tkufa is basically 30 days after December 21st, which will bring you to January 21st. So January 21st, according to this, is Shvat of the Tkufa. So when you talk about Tu B'Shvat, okay, then you would say, I guess, 15 days after that. When you say Tu B'Shvat, does it go by the solar calendar or the lunar calendar? Now, it's actually a very good question, but the question sounds strange to us because we never heard of Shvat of the Tkufa. But assuming there's such a thing, and it makes sense even if you wouldn't call it Shvat of the Tkufa, but the point is, shouldn't this go by the solar calendar? Because it has to do with, and we saw in yesterday's daf, what did they explain? There was that strange line that said, what's the reason why they determined Tu B'Shvat? Because ho'il v'yatzu rov gishmei shana, v'adayin rov tkufa mibachutz, which we said didn't really make much sense, because it says most of the rain is finished, but we still have a lot of the winter left, to which the Gemara said what it really meant to say was, even though we still have a lot of the winter left, most of the rain has ended, and that made a little more sense. But I have to say, I looked up over the weekend, the Yerushalmi has a totally different version, which actually says much better version. I don't remember the exact wording, but it was basically most of the rain is ended and most of the winter is beyond us. It made a lot more sense. And what would be a reason for the difference between them? Difference between the winter in Israel and the winter in Babylonia. Right? It makes a lot of sense. That in Babylonia, the winter was longer and it was colder climate than in Israel. So therefore, could be that's why the Babylonians had to change it because it didn't make sense to them. What do you mean? Most of the winter's over. Most of the winter isn't actually over. So people living in certain places around the world that have longer winter days longer winter season could understand that statement, right? Could understand how that could happen. The interesting thing I discovered over the weekend. Okay. Now we're going to, so that we're left with our question. Is it right? Shouldn't it go by solar? Because the solar is what's more in sync with the seasons. And this is a seasonal thing. So Amarle de Chodeshim, he said, it's months. Okay. It goes by Tu B'Shvat on the calendar, and that we know to be. So now, either it was again Rabbi Yochanan asked Rabbi Yanai, or maybe Rabbi asked Rabbi Nachman. Great question. What if it's a leap year? If it's a leap year, it's basically saying Shvat is not really in the right time, or certainly Adar isn't, or Nisan isn't, so we're going to add another Adar, but presumably Shvat is not either in the right time. So maybe in a year like that, what would be smarter? After Shvat comes Adar. Adar Rishon is really Shvat of that year. So maybe it should be Tet Vav of Adar Rishon. So they say, no. Amarle halacha rov shanim. Even though it doesn't really match the reality, in the end, this is what we call, in other words, the rabbis often say, lo plug. We don't want to start distinguishing and saying, this year we're going to have it a different day. And this year, it gets too confusing. It's Shvat, that's what it is. Zeu gamarnu sof sipul, right? Okay, we're going to keep it the same, even though probably your question is a pretty good question. Now we're going to have two opinions, Rabba and Rav Hamnuna, about, and this is going to be where the daf gets a little bit complicated. There's a chart. You can use the chart. Hopefully it'll help. About what we do with an etrog from the 6th year going into the 7th year and the 7th year going into the 8th year. Okay. What do we do for Shemitah? What do we do for Maser? So far, we saw this machlok of Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer. Does it go by Chanata? No matter what, that's Rabbi Eliezer. Rabban Gamliel says we're going to treat it differently for Maser and for Shemitah. And in fact, they're going to both follow Rabban Gamliel, but you're going to see that practically speaking, it's going to come out a little different than Rabban Gamliel said. So again, Rabban Gamliel said for Maser, we're going to go by when it's gathered and not by when it budded. For Shemitah, we're going to go by when it budded. So therefore, we're going to see here, Amarabba, but they disagree about one point. We're going to have to understand it as we go through. Etrog bat shishit shenechnesa l'shviit. So I want to try to keep things as simple as possible so you can follow. When it comes to Shemitah, for sure it goes by budding, according to both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabban Gamliel. We'll see not everybody agrees with this, but they both think that that's what the situation is. So etrog bat shishit shenechnesa l'shviit. So if it's shishi going into shviit, the 7th year, p'tura min ha'maaser u'p'tura min ha'bi'ur. What is bi'ur? Before we even get further on, bi'ur means that when it says about the Shemitah year, the produce that grows in your field is for you to eat and for your animals. So as soon as it's no longer out there for your animals, meaning there's nothing out there in the fields anymore, you have to do what's called bi'ur. You have to get rid of whatever you brought into your house. There's a big machloket about bi'ur. Doesn't mean you have to destroy it like bi'ur chametz, okay, to totally destroy it. Or does it mean that you have to make it hefker and say, anyone can come and take it, but you can still eat it yourself. Okay, there's a big debate what bi'ur means. That's an aside right now, not important for our purposes, but just so you know what bi'ur is, it's important to understand. So now, when it says p'tura min ha'bi'ur, it basically is saying, in other words, it doesn't have laws of Shemitah on it. Okay, because makes sense, because it's from the 6th year it budded. It grew in this, right? We picked it in the 7th year, but it had already budded in the 6th year, so it doesn't have laws of Shemitah. So it's p'tura min ha'bi'ur, but it's also p'tura min ha'maaser. We're going to have to understand why is it exempt from maaser. It should be obligated in maaser because it goes by the 6th year. So we'll get back to that, right? So what did we say? We also said it goes by likita, right? This is Rabban Gamliel who holds that it goes by likita for maaser, and you picked it in the 7th year, so it's exempt from maaser. Okay, now, next one, bat shvi'it shenechnesa l'shmi'it, the obvious next case. If it budded in the Shemitah year, and you picked it in the 8th year, p'tura b'maaser v'chayevet b'bi'ur. So it's exempt from tithing because it was, now this is tricky because it should really be obligated in tithing because tithing goes by when you gathered it, you collected it, you picked it in the 8th year, should be obligated in maaser and chayevet b'bi'ur. But it's all right for Shemitah, you have to do bi'ur. So we're going to have to understand why it's p'tura mimaaser. So Amar le'abai, bishlam seifa l'chumra. The seifa I get. Why? Well, there's another issue. It's not exactly l'chumra. Some of the commentaries say l'chumra is a weird use of the term here because l'chumra means they're being stringent. But really, what is it? The 7th year it budded. So it's Shemitah. If it's Shemitah, what do you do with Shemitah produce? You have to be mafkir. You have to say this is hefker. That means ownerless. Once you say it's ownerless, well, then you're not obligated in tithing because anything that's ownerless doesn't have laws of maaser on them. So for a different reason, it basically becomes not exempt from maaser. So theoretically, it should be chayav and maaser, but because it's Shemitah produce, it becomes hefker, and hefker becomes exempt from maaser. So that's the seifa. But el reisha p'tura min ha'bi'ur amai. Why is it exempt from bi'ur? Well, we explain that pretty easily. The reisha it's exempt from bi'ur because it's produce from the 6th year. So now they're going to say, but wait, if that's the case, tamrin an zil batar chanata. If you're going to go by chanata, now I explain maybe this is like Rabban Gamliel, but they're assuming no, it sounds like it's Rabbi Eliezer that everything goes by chanata. If so, ihachi t'chayev b'maaser. If it goes by chanata, it should go by chanata for maaser also. If it goes by chanata for maaser, then it should be exempt from it should be chayav b'maaser because it budded in the 6th year. So Amarle. Yadako. So they explain differently. Not that he necessarily goes like Rabban Gamliel. Really might hold like Rabbi Eliezer. Everything is chanata, but Yadako mimash mishimba va'at amar tichayev b'maaser. Rabbi says the following. He says, listen, when you come and you deal with when it's the Shemitah year, what happens? Everything of yours becomes hefker. Now, this tree is an etrog tree, so it's a little different for the other trees. So it's not really hefker. But since people come into your field in general, touching everything, it almost became hefker because even though you didn't make it hefker, sometimes people could turn things into hefker by treating it like hefker. So since it got treated like everything else is hefker, therefore, this is a bit of a weird assumption because most trees this really actually budded in the 6th year. Most of we're going to have to assume that in the field were trees that had budded in the 7th year, that it was a mixture of all sorts of things. And a lot of them had budded in the 7th year and were already growing in the 7th year. People were picking them from the 7th year. And then you'd have to assume that they must have been touching this tree as well. And because of that, they kind of turned it into Hafker, and therefore it actually became exempt from Maaser. Okay, that's the way they explain Rabbah right now. Rav Hamnuna Amal. Rav Hamnuna says, Bat Shishit Shenechneset L'Shvi'it La'olam Shishit. He disagrees with the first part of what Rabbah said. What are you talking about? If it grew in if it budded in the Shishit, then it goes by the Shishit all the way, which means you're not exempt from Maaser. Just because people touch it doesn't really make it ownerless. He says, this is Shishit. You're obligated in Maaser. So it says, Bat Shishit Shenechneset L'Shvi'it La'olam Shishit. Ubat Shvi'it Hanechneset L'Shminit La'olam Shvi'it. Okay, it says it goes by the year, basically. Okay, whatever it is, right? So we're going to have. So again, if you go, I made the chart, right? So Rav Hamnuna, the main part that they differ on, right? When it comes to the Shvi'it Nechneset L'Shminit, everybody agrees it's going to be treated as Shemitah and not as Maaser. Shemitah all the way. But when it comes to Shishit Nechneset L'Shvi'it, there's a machloket about, do we treat it for Maaser? Do we say it's exempt from Maaser because people treated it as if it was Hefker along with their other trees? Or do we say, no, it's obligated in Maaser? Okay? Because it's treated like a Shishit. So now they say, so that was the machloka between them. But now they bring a question on both of them from the following Brighton. I told you we're going to see in the end that there's really 4 approaches. So now we've seen 2. We saw 2 Tanaitic approaches. One is to say there's a split between Maaser and Shvi'it. Maaser is treated like a vegetable and Shemitah is treated like a tree, that it goes by Chanatah. And then we saw Rabbi Eliezer says it's entirely treated like a tree. Okay, that was that whole thing, right? It's ki ilan lechol davar. Okay, and now we're going to see a 4th opinion, I would say, because the 3rd one's going to come up later, but I would really say those 3 are kind of a threesome. And this 4th is a bit of a different one. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer, Mishum Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says in the name of a different Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Etrog bat Shishi. Remember, every regular Rabbi Shimon is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Etrog bat Shishit, Shenechneset L'Shvi'it. Okay, so again, it budded, this is our classic case, budded in the 6th year, grew in the 7th. P'tura min ha'maaser, p'tura min ha'bi'ur. It's exempt from everything. Okay, this sounds a lot like Rabbah in the beginning. Okay, she'en lecha davar shechayav b'maaser, ela im ken gadal b'chiyuv v'nilkap b'chiyuv. He gives a different reason. He said, you're never going to be obligated in maaser unless it budded in that year and it was picked in that year. They have to all happen in the same year for it to be considered maaser. This is a totally different approach than what we've seen before. If it's 1 in 1, then no. Okay, it has to have budded and be picked in the same year. Now, he says it in the wording, she'ein lecha davar. It sounds like he's talking across the board, trees, any trees, not just etrog. There's actually a debate among the commentaries. Why does it sound that way? Because he says, why is the etrog like this? Because you don't have anything else that does, right? In other words, this is across the board, it sounds like. But some of the commentaries say, no. He clearly can't be saying this across the board, and he really only means etrog. And he's saying because an etrog wouldn't be obligated unless it's both, and that he's making an exception. So there's a big debate about whether he's only talking about etrog here, or it would really be true for any tree. Okay, and that's a big halacha he's saying, although we don't hold like him, so it doesn't really matter, l'maaseh, but practically speaking, but he does say this. And then he says, ubat shvi'it, shenechneset l'shminit, if it's 7th year produce that goes into the 8th year, but in the 7th then continued to grow in the 8th, and you picked it in the 8th, p'tura min ha'maaser u'p'tura min ha'bi'ur. Now it's exempt both from maaser and it's not considered shemitah. Now on this he disagrees with both Rabbah and Rav Hamnuna, because Rabbah and Rav Hamnuna said no, 7th going into 8th is treated as shemitah produce. He thinks not treated as shemitah produce. He says the same thing. You're not going to have bior unless it grew in the 7th and it was picked in the 7th. Okay, so before we move on, I just want to point out another debate among the commentaries about this state. Notice he's talking specifically about bior. Now, Shemitah has 2 things. Number 1, there's sanctity to the produce, kedushat shvit. Number 2, there's bior. That once it's no longer out in the fields, you have to destroy it in your house. Some people think that when he says this, it has to have been, right, in order to be obligated maaser, it has to have both budded and been picked in the same year. In order to have biur and shmita, it has to be both budded and picked in the 7th year. So some people say he means basically it's not shmita produce, no kedushat shvi'it either. Some people say no, he was only talking about biur. The chiyuv of biur doesn't apply, but of course it has kedushat shvi'it to it. Nobody says it doesn't have kedushat shvi'it to it. Okay, so it's a big debate. Again, obviously nowadays we don't go by this. Of course it has kedushat shvi'it, even if it budded in 1 year and then the next year, right? That's why most people's fruit trees actually bud 1 year and grow the next year. And most of Shemitah for fruits is going to be next year. Depends on the fruit tree and it depends on what it is. But the point is that there's a big debate among what he holds about whether he holds it across the board in Shemitah or just in biur. But the point is now, Reisha Kashi l'Rav Hamnuna, Seifa Kashi bein l'Rava bein l'Rav Hamnuna. Right? The Reisha is a problem to Rav Hamnuna because again, what did he say? He said it's exempt from Maaser. Remember, Rav Hamnuna said, no, it's Maaser. It's going to be obligated in Maaser because it grew in the 6th year. Remember, and Rabba had said, no, we're going to exempt it from Maaser because everybody touches it and they treat it like hefker. Rav Hamnuna didn't agree with that. But in the end, Rabba says the same thing that Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Shimon, but Rav Hamnuna disagrees. But when it comes to the Seifa, it's a question against both of them. They both go against what he says because he says it's not chayav and biur because it was picked in a different year. And they both say, no. 7th year budded, it's Shemitah produce. So how do we resolve that? So to which the Gemara says, Tanaihi, don't worry. That's a Tanaitic opinion, but there's a Tanaitic debate about this. And we're now going to bring 2 other opinions, which now we're going to finally get to that 3rd one I told you about. Tanya Amar Rabbi Yossi, Avtum Se'i Mishum Chamishas Kenim, Etrog Atar Lekitato L'Maaser. But Rabbotenu Nimnu B'Usha V'Amru Achar Lekitato Bein L'Maaser Bein L'Shvi'it. Okay, let's just go back. Rabban Gamliel, remember, said it's like a fruit for most things, including Shemitah, but we're going to treat it like a vegetable when it comes to Maaser, which means Chanata for Shvi'it, Likita for gathering for Maaser. Rabbi Eliezer said it's like an ilan lechol davar. It's totally like a tree. Chanata comes of Tulmus and he testifies in the name of 5 Zkenim and says, no, it's the opposite. It's like a vegetable in everything. So that's why I said those are like 3 basic opinions. Then we have this 4th opinion, which is this weird one about I'm sorry, I said it wrong. It's Rabotenu and Usha who said that about Lakita. My mistake. I just confused them. Rabotenu but Usha said it's like Lakita for everything. It's like vegetables. Of Tulmus actually matches, we're going to see in a minute, matches Rabban Gamliel. Okay, because he only talks about Maaser. Okay, to which the Gemara says, I'll actually continue with this from 1 more minute, but then to review, so Rabbi Shimon has this weird approach that it has to be, right, in order to be Maaser or Shvi'it, it has to have both been budded and picked in the same year. Otherwise, it doesn't have those laws at all. Again, which maybe doesn't have biur or maybe doesn't have kedushat shvi'it even at all. So now we're going to just explain this braita a little bit better. Shvi'it man dechar shemei. Something's weird about this. If Tulmus was only talking about Maaser, and then in comes the rabbis in Usha, and they say, whatever you said from Maaser is true also for Shvi'it. So they say, how did they get to Shvi'it? So they say, really, it's missing some words, and this is how it should read. And then we'll see that Tulmus holds 100% like Rabban Gamliel. Etrog atar lekitato l'maaser v'achar chanata l'shvi'it. Tulmus was saying there's a distinction between maaser and shmita. V'rabotenu nimnu b'usha, but they got up and voted in Usha and decided achar lekitato, we're going to go by gathering date, bein l'maaser, bein l'shvi'it, for everything. Okay, so again, that becomes this new opinion that we haven't seen until now, which is it's 100% treated like a vegetable. Okay, so we have lots of different approaches to how to treat this. And then even within that, and then we're going to basically say that Rabba and Rav Hamnuna, now we're going to understand them a little differently than before, that they must hold like Rav, like of Tulmus, who distinguishes between Shemitah and Maaser, and that's why they'll say, right, when it comes to Maaser, we're going to treat it differently than when it comes to Shemitah, and it's going to have different laws, right? The different, where the Etrog Bat Shishit, and the Knesset L'Shvi'it is P'turam and a Biur, right? And yet treated like Maaser, although there was a debate. Again, Rabbi said, well, since everyone treats it like hefker, it's going to be exempt from Maaser. And the Shvit, and the Knesset L'Shminit, is going to be Chayevet B'Biur, because it's Shvi'it, and it goes Batar the Chanata. But when it comes to maaser, it really goes by likita, and you're cutting it in the eighth, it should be obligated in maaser. Why is it not obligated? Oh, well, because of a different reason, because it's hefker. Okay, but really, he holds like of tumus. So that's basically our resolution to, we basically brought a braita against Rabba and Rav Hamnuna, this opinion of Rabbi Shimon. We said that's just Rabbi Shimon, but there's a ton of Iddic debate about it. Theoretically, they could have brought Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer, but they didn't. They probably brought, the later generation, which was the rabbis in Usha, and they wanted to say that even later, it was also, there was this debate. Itma. Now it was said, Rabbi Yochanan v'Rish Lakish Amrit Ravayu. Now we're also having what other people say about this same issue. Etrog bat shishit shenechneset l'shvi'it la'olam shishit. In etrog, the budded in the 6th year goes by the 6th year. This sounds like Rabbi Eliezer. Everything goes by when it budded, for everything. Kiyata Ravin amar Rabbi Yochanan. When Ravin came from Israel, he brought the Torah of Rabbi Yochanan and said, Etrog bat shishit shenechneset l'shvi'it. This is exactly the same thing, just said in different words. Afilu kizayif and asakikal chayavin alav mishum teva. Even if it was only the size of an olive when the 7th year kicked in, and then it became the size of a loaf of bread, right? It's basically using an exaggerated, right? It was teeny, and then it grew gigantic. Chayavin alav mishum teva. Even though the majority of the growth happened in the 7th year, we're still going to treat it like the 6th year. Okay, this is what we just discussed in yesterday's talk, that it's all because it's nurturing off of the water it gained from the previous year and the sap from the tree, which is from the rain from the previous year. And that's what's basically contributing to the tree growing. And therefore it goes by when it budded. And then basically we're saying an etrog is no different from any other tree. Okay. And this approach is to say an etrog is treated like all other trees. So again, we had a slew of different approaches, right? Going from 100% like a vegetable, 100% like a tree, or 50-50. Maaser, vegetable, Shemitah, right? Like a tree. And then, right, some ramifications that even though maybe it should be obligated in Maaser if you're going to do this split, but it's not because it ends up being Hefker because it's Shemitah. And then Hefker exempts you from Maaser. And that was Rabbi and Rav Hamnuna. And then this one distinction between them about whether if people treat it like Hefker, is that Hefker or no? Only if the owner treats it and makes it ownerless, it's Hefker. And then this last weird opinion about Rabbi Shimon that it has to be all in the same year for it to be considered either Maaser or Shemitah. Okay, that's the end of our etrog topic, which was quite complicated. And now we're moving back to trees in general. Tanu Rabbanan. Ilan shechantu perotav kodem tu b'shvat, mitaser l'shana shavra. This is already pretty simple. If it budded before Tu B'Shvat of the previous year, again, this all goes back to tree goes by budding, and the date of trees is Tu B'Shvat. So this is very simple and obvious then. Achar Tu B'Shvat mitaser l'shana haba. If it was, let's say, 3rd and 4th year, so if it happened, the budding happened after Tu B'Shvat, and it was already considered year number 4, then it will go by, the Maaser will be for year number 4. However, we're now going to have all of a sudden something new here. Amar Rabbi Nechemia, Bameh dvarim amurim, this whole thing about trees, that it goes by when it budded, is not for all trees, according to Rabbi Nechemia. He's going to say, Bilan she'oseh shtei brechot b'shana. It's only true for trees that have 2 broods a year. That's what brechot are. To which the Gemara says, Shtei brechot zal kadatach. What are you talking about 2 broods? Broods are for birds. Remember, we had the whole thing in Beitza about birds that have 2 broods and 2 seasons of when they give birth and things like that. That's an animal bird terminology. It has nothing to do with fruit trees. So they say, Ela ema ke'ein shtei brechot. What they mean is, if it buds once, but they grow in different cycles, they over time, they ripen throughout the year, okay, in different time periods, then we're going to have an issue. And that's why we do a chanata. Aval, ilan ha'oseh brecha achat. But if they all ripen at the same time, kigon, dikalim, like palm trees, vizitim, olive trees, v'charuvim, carob trees, af al pi shechantu perotehem kodem Tu B'Shvat mitasrim l'shana haba. Even though they budded before Tu B'Shvat, they go by that next year when we collect them, okay, when we pick them. First big question is, number one, before we even get to the main topic, olives, wait a minute, didn't we say olives are shlish, a third? They don't go after chanata or likita How did we all of a sudden bring olives into the picture here? Remember, olives are by the Torah law, and by Torah law, it's shlish, and that's true for olives, grapes, and grains. So how could we possibly bring up olives here? So the commentaries say these olives are different. Olives that are Torah are ones that are meant, the olives are picked either to make olive oil or to eat, to make olives out of them. If you pick them to eat the olives themselves, you're not obligated maser d'oraita. Very interesting, right? Because remember, the Torah said dagan, tirosh, and yitzhar. Tirosh would be the same thing for grapes. Grapes that are picked to eat are not the same as grapes picked for wine. Grapes picked for wine and olives picked for olive oil, those are the ones that have a Torah obligation. But if they're picking them for eating them as fruit, then they're not. So you would have to say that's what this is talking about. And now we're going to say, even though they budded before Tu B'Shvat, their maser goes by the following. Okay, they're mitaslim when you pick them. Okay, now why is this? Because this is exactly like, you remember the case of Hashrashav taking root, and we said that the rabbis came in and said, we're changing the law because if we keep the law as is, people are going to, if we go by Likita, what's going to happen? You're going to gather some today, you're going to gather some tomorrow, your cutoff point date is going to be right in between. You're going to end up with a mixture of both. We don't want that to happen. So if they all ripen at the same time, then we don't have an issue. We're not worried. They all ripen at the same time. You're not going to end up with a batch from earlier and a batch from later, unless it's exactly around the ripening date. But we're assuming they don't ripen all right around that date, right? Tu B'Shvat. So therefore, right, we usually ripen after. So therefore, we're not worried. But when they ripen at all different times, we're worried that if we go by Likita, now this gives a whole different reason for Likita, right? Chanata. We said Chanata is because the tree gets sustenance from the water and all that from the previous year. This is basically saying, no, the reason they said Chanata was to avoid problems. If you gather and it over a long period of time, you might end up with some fruits that are from earlier and some fruits that are from later, and you'll end up accidentally tithing one on the other. So to avoid that problem, they said, let's go back to when it buds, just like let's go back to when it takes root with the other things that we discussed. And that's Rabbi Nechemiah's position. So now the last part of the daf is this psak of Rabbi, or this, not psak, I should say, this statement of Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, nahagu ha'am becharuvim ki Rabbi Nechemiah. And we don't really hold like Rabbi Nechemiah, right? Rabbis don't agree with him. And that's why we have trees go by budding. But came Rabbi Yochanan, he said, people, the custom was when it came to carob specifically, they held like Rabbi Nechemiah and they went by the date of when they collected them. So, Eitive, Rish Lakish the Rabbi Yochanan. Rish Lakish comes and questions Rabbi Yochanan and says, what are you talking about? Benot shuach, shvi'it shalahem shniya, mipnei she'osot l'shalosh hashani. Says, how could you say that? These white figs, although there is a bit of a different, there's a bit of a machlok at what exactly is benot shuach, but let's assume they're white figs. Their shvi'it is shniya, okay, mipnei she'osot l'shalosh hashani. When are they counted as shvi'it? In the second year of the Shemitah cycle. Why? Because they bud in the 7th year, but it takes them 3 years to grow. The Shemitah year, the first year, and the second year. And they only really grow in the second year. So because of that, when you have white figs in the second year of the Shemitah cycle, you treat those as Shemitah. Okay? So what does that show you? Even though, right, now these are things that bud once a year, right? They ripen once a year. They're like carobs, and yet we treat them by Chanata and not by Likita. So what's Rabbi Yochanan's response? And to this, we're going to have a lot of questions on Rabbi Yochanan. Ishtik. He was silent. He didn't respond. So now Rabbi Abba Kohen is going to come and question and say, he could have said this, he could have said that, he could have said that. It's going to bring 3 possible answers. Why didn't Rabbi Yochanan say? Until finally, right, each time we're going to say, oh, he couldn't have said that because of that, couldn't have said that because of that. But the third one, we're not going to have an answer, to which he's going to understand Rabbi Yochanan's silence in a different way. First, we understand the silence. When somebody's silent, right? Usually we say shtika ka'oda'ah. He was silent. He must have realized, kind of admitting defeat. Like I must have been wrong by saying what I said. Or I don't really have a good answer for you. That's what we assume. So Amalei Rabbi Abba Rabbi Kohen the Rabbi Yossi Kohen. Amai ishtik. Why was he silent? Le'malei could have said, Amin alcha ana Rabbi Nechemiah va'at amar li Rabbanan. Rish Lakish brought a question on him from a Braita, but the Braita he brought was a Braita. It's actually a Mishnah, sorry. It's a Mishnah that goes like the rabbis. And what did Rabbi Yochanan say? I was telling you that people did with carobs like Rabbi Nechemiah. So why are you questioning me from the rabbi's opinion if I was talking according to Rabbi Nechemiah? So why didn't you just say that? That would have been a very easy answer. To which he says, Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, I guess, answers back. The reason he didn't say that was Mishum Da'amrle. He could have said to him, Shavak Rabbanan va'avid ke Rabbi Nechemiah. Why would you have left Rabbi Nechemiah and why would you have left the rabbi? And we always know if there's rabbis disagreeing with a single person, we go by the rabbis. So if Rabbi Yochanan had said to him, I was talking according to Rabbi Nechemiah and you're questioning me on the rabbis, but Rabbi Rish Lakish will say, well, why aren't you holding like the rabbis? Why did you say they do like Rabbi Nechemiah and holding like Rabbi Nechemiah? It doesn't make any sense. We always hold like the rabbis. It makes no sense. Okay, so that didn't work. Second option he could have asked. He could have said, notice what Rabbi Yochanan said. He said, the people did this. He didn't say, I said it was okay. I just was testifying that this is what I see people do. Of course, I don't think it's okay. In other words, you're questioning me by saying it's forbidden what they did. But I wasn't talking about in the language of, it was okay, it wasn't okay. I was just saying this is what they did and you're questioning me but isn't it forbidden? I agree with you, it was forbidden. I'm just telling you this is what they did. So why couldn't he have said that? Rish Lakish will say to him, it's very nice, nahagu, but if that's not the halacha, you should have stopped them, right? When people are doing a custom against what's customary, what we know to be the halacha, they have to keep the halacha. You should have said something to them. So that wouldn't work either. However, this third one is going to work. He says, wait a minute. I was talking about maaser of charuvim. Now, maaser of charuvim, we know already, maaser is only daganti rosh and yitzhar on a Torah level. The case I brought, Nahagu Amki Rabbi Nechemiah, was rabbinic only. It was rabbinic, so they did something like Rabbi Nechemiah. It's not the biggest deal, because anyway, it's only rabbinic. But you brought me a question about Benot Shuach and Shnat Shemitah. Now, Benot Shuach, there's no distinction of Daganti Rosh and Yitzhar and Shnat Shemitah. Shnat Shemitah affects everything on a Torah level. So you were bringing me something on a Torah level. But I was talking about something on a rabbinic level. Those two, right? It would have been a very good answer that Rabbi Yochanan had brought. Therefore, Rabbi Abba Kohen, he said, since he really had a good claim and he could have said that. Now, one option is to say, maybe Rabbi Yochanan just didn't think of that, right? But because they have such reverence for Rabbi Yochanan, they can't possibly imagine that if they came up with an answer that Rabbi Yochanan could have said, he couldn't have come up with it himself. Therefore, he says, Timhani im shiva Rish Lakish l'tshuvaza. First, he suggests maybe Rish Lakish didn't really ask this question, to which the Gemara says, im shiva ha'otva. In other words, how could you say Timhani if he really asked this question? He asked the question. We have that he asked the question. You can't just deny, and erase that line in the Gemara. We know he asked that question. So, Ela Ema, what he really meant to say was, im kibla Rabbi Yochanan im lo kibla. How do we understand Rabbi Yochanan's silence? Is his silence understood as, I accept I'm wrong? Or is his silence understood as, your question was such a silly question and I have such an easy answer that I'm not even going to bother to respond? And this is an interesting way. We're actually ending right now. I feel like I should say a hadran. We should say a hadran together at this point because we're finally finishing this first Mishnah. We finished all the dealings with all the Rosh Hashanah. Tomorrow we're going to get to when Ba'arba Prakim Ha'olam Nidon, the world is judged 4 times a year. And which is obviously comparison, the 4 Rosh Hashanah, which we said weren't necessarily really 4, but we have the 4 Rosh Hashanah and the 4 Prakim. So anyway, we're now finished. And I think it's an interesting way to end because it's about how rabbis respond to each other and how they react, right? And Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish were not just your average. Rish Lakish was sort of a student. Rabbi Yochanan, if you remember the story, pulls him in to be, to start learning. And we'll get to that famous story. Anyway, and they become chavruto really, right? And they become their like Talmid Chaver. And it seems weird that Rabbi Yochanan would respond to him in this kind of a way. And here it's interesting in terms of ending. We had all this stuff about rabbinic law, and there seems to be this theme. Shoshana brought up at the end of class the other day about rabbinic law and how important rabbinic law is. It's also how rabbis interact with each other and how, and here how do we understand someone's silence? How do we understand their relationship? How would we define the nature of the silence? And this idea almost of the reverence of the Amoraim of Rabbi Yochanan, that it couldn't possibly be that he had an answer and that we know an answer that he could have said, he didn't say it. And therefore they have to reread the story into understanding it some other way, that he must have been silent because he didn't really want to even bother responding because it was so obvious to him that there was an easy answer. So it's, obviously this is open to interpretation. We don't know what really happened and why he really was silent. And, it's back to this idea about when you don't express yourself, how do we know what you mean and how important it is to have proper lines of communication and say what you really mean, which is what we're dealing with all the time in the Gemara, things that are unclear and are open to interpretation, which we saw a lot of them today. As I mentioned, there's some of the commentaries say this, some of the right. It's a lot open to interpretation. And that's part of what learning is all about, to try to come up with what it is, but always knowing that we don't really know. And maybe that's part of an interesting way to end this. Have a Shavua Tov, and we will meet up tomorrow.